You ever get that feeling that history is just repeating itself? Well, there's a fascinating theory that says it does, in these really predictable cycles. Today, we're going to dive into that theory and see if it can shed some light on this huge wave of online censorship we're all seeing. Is it just a clampdown, or is it, like the theory suggests, the opening act for a much, much bigger crisis? Let's get into it.
So, right off the bat, this theory frames a crisis as more than just a rough patch. We're talking about a full-on societal reset. It's this dramatic idea that the world as we know it isn't just collapsing, it's on the verge of a violent rebirth.
So where does an idea like this even come from? It's called the Four Turnings Theory, and it was developed by two historians, William Strauss and Neil Howe. They basically proposed it as this powerful lens for looking at the grand patterns of history, suggesting our future might be a lot more predictable than we'd like to think.
Okay, so the main building block of the whole theory is this thing called a saculum. Just think of it as one full cycle, kind of like a long human life, running about 80 to 100 years. And within each saculum, society goes through four totally distinct phases, or turnings. Let's break down what those look like.
The easiest way to think about the four turnings is like seasons. First, you get the high. That's the spring, a time of strong institutions, collective optimism, everybody's on the same page. Then comes the awakening, which is like summer, a time of cultural rebellion. People start questioning things. That leads into the unraveling, or autumn, where society gets fragmented. It's all about individualism and cynicism. And finally, you hit the crisis, a brutal winter where society faces some kind of existential threat and is forced to tear itself down to rebuild, often violently.
Now here's the kicker. According to the source material, this isn't some far-off future problem. We're living in it, right now. Proponents of this theory say our current fourth turning, our winter, kicked off with the 2008 financial crash, and they predict it won't be over until the late 2020s, maybe even the early 2030s.
So what does this winter actually look like in the real world? Well, the argument is that we're seeing it manifest as a massive global clampdown on free expression. And a key example of this is coming out of Europe.
A perfect example is the EU's Digital Services Act, or the DSA. Now, critics, including some in U.S. congressional investigations, are calling it a foreign censorship threat. Why? Because it basically forces online platforms to apply the EU's content rules to everyone, worldwide. And with fines that can go up to 6% of a company's global turnover, you better believe they're going to over-censor just to be safe. But the real danger, critics warn, is in these emergency powers that let the EU Commission suppress content it doesn't like, even if that content is true, but just politically inconvenient.
So how do you get the public on board with this much control? The argument from the source is that you use a justification that's impossible to argue with, protecting children. The idea is that this really noble goal is being used as a kind of Trojan horse for much, much broader surveillance and censorship that affects all of us.
And this right here is the heart of the issue. The stated goal is protecting children. I mean, who's going to argue with that? But what critics are warning about is that the actual outcome is mass data surveillance that sweeps up every single user. Let's look at a really specific case.
Okay, so take YouTube's new policy that's set to roll out. It uses an AI to guess your age based on everything you do, what you watch, your account info, all your activity. If its algorithm flags you as possibly being under 18, boom, you're automatically restricted. Now, the big worry here isn't just that it'll get it wrong for a bunch of adults, it's the sheer amount of behavioral data it has to collect on everyone just to make these guesses in the first place. It's a fundamental invasion of privacy.
And it's not just YouTube. In the U.S. Congress, you've got the Kids Online Safety Act, KOSA. Again, that name is incredibly powerful emotionally. But critics, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, are saying its language is so vague that it could force platforms to just filter huge swaths of legitimate content for everybody to avoid getting sued.
This all brings up a really critical question, right? Especially when you see things like Spotify starting to use age verification for, song lyrics. You have to ask, if this is really for the children, why does the solution risk the privacy of every single adult user? Is the real goal safety? Or is it to get us all comfortable with a system of total digital identification and surveillance?
So according to the fourth turning theory, this whole censorship clampdown, it isn't the final chapter. No, it's actually the trigger for what comes next.
The theory predicts that when institutions overreach like this, it completely shatters public trust and sets the stage for a violent, powerful backlash. And let's be clear, this is not just a theory. This trend is happening globally. According to Freedom House, political rights and civil liberties went downhill in 60 countries in the last year alone. 60! That creates an environment that is just ripe for unrest.
And if you think that's just a problem for other places, look at this. This is from a Newsweek poll. A full 40% of Americans believe a civil war is likely in the next decade. 40%. The idea of a violent internal conflict is not some fringe theory anymore. It's a mainstream fear, and it reflects just how deep the divisions are in a society that's supposedly in a crisis.
So the proposed timeline here, the path to conflict, is pretty clear. It starts with widespread global censorship. That, in turn, leads to a massive erosion of public trust in our institutions. From there, you see a rise in political violence, which the theory says could ultimately culminate in an armed uprising.
And that leads us to the final and, frankly, the most startling piece of this whole theory. It doesn't just predict the collapse. It makes a bold prediction about what comes after the collapse. And this is where it gets really counterintuitive. The theory actually reframes rebellion. It doesn't see it as just chaos and destruction. It sees it as a necessary, almost heroic act. It's the fire that purges a corrupt, decaying system and makes way for something new and stronger to be born from the ashes. A new high, a new spring. But, and this is a very big but, the theory's ultimate warning is that this change doesn't happen peacefully. As the source puts it, societies in crisis regenerate through trial, often violently. To get to that new spring, you have to go through the absolute worst of the winter.
So it leaves us all with this huge, unsettling question. If the theory is right, if this cycle of censorship and crisis does lead to some kind of fiery rebellion, what is it that actually emerges on the other side? What new values? What new society? What exactly is it that gets reborn from that fire? That's the question the fourth turning forces us to confront.